The evening shift at Belmont Music Academy always started the same way. The students would pack up their instruments, the teachers would lock their doors, and then the building would go quiet. That was when Raymond would start his work. He had been a janitor at this place for almost 3 years now. Every night, he mopped the floors, emptied the trash, and wiped down the windows. It was honest work. It paid the bills, but it was never just a job to him. Raymond was 52 years old. His hands were rough from years of labor. His back hurt most days, but there was something about this building that made him feel alive. It was the music. Even after the students left, the echoes stayed behind. He could still hear the violins, the cellos, the flutes, and most of all, he could hear the piano. There was a grand piano in the main recital hall. It sat on a small stage under soft golden lights. Raymond had never touched it. He knew better than that, but every night, after finishing his rounds, he would stand in the doorway of that hall and just look at it. Sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes longer. He didn't know how to play. He never learned. His family didn't have money for things like music lessons when he was growing up. But he loved the sound of it more than anything in the world. At home, Raymond lived in a small apartment with his son. The boy was 12 years old. His name was Theo. It had always been just the two of them. Theo's mother passed away when he was only 4. She got sick, and they couldn't afford the treatment she needed. Raymond still remembered holding her hand in that hospital room. She looked at him and said, "Take care of our boy. Make sure he has a good life." He promised her he would, and every single day since then, he tried to keep that promise. Theo was a quiet kid. He didn't talk much at school. He didn't have many friends, but he was curious about everything. He loved to read, he loved to draw, and more than anything, he loved to listen to his father hum. Every night, when Raymond came home from work, he would sit on the edge of Theo's bed and hum the songs he had heard at the academy. He didn't know the names of the pieces. He just remembered the melodies. Theo would close his eyes and listen. Sometimes he would ask his father to hum the same song again, and Raymond always did. "Dad," Theo asked one night, "what does that big piano look like?" Raymond smiled. "It's beautiful, son. It's long and black and shiny. When the light hits it, it almost glows, and the keys are so white, they look like they've never been touched." Theo nodded slowly. "Do you think I could ever learn to play something like that?" Raymond felt a pain in his chest. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to promise his son the world, but he knew the truth. Lessons at the academy cost more than he made in a month. Private teachers were even more expensive. And they didn't even have a piano at home. They barely had enough space for a small kitchen table. "Maybe one day," Raymond said quietly. "When things get better." Theo didn't say anything. He just nodded again and turned over to sleep. But Raymond didn't know something. He didn't know that Theo had been keeping a secret. A few months earlier, Theo had found something in the alley behind their building. It was an old electric keyboard. Someone had thrown it away. Half the keys didn't work. The screen was cracked, but Theo carried it home and hid it under his bed. Every night, after his father left for work, he would pull it out and practice. He didn't have any lessons. He didn't have any books. He only had the melodies his father hummed to him. And somehow, note by note, he figured out how to play them. At first, it was just noise. His fingers were clumsy. The broken keys made it harder. But Theo didn't give up. He listened to his father's humming over and over in his head. He pictured the notes like steps on a ladder, and slowly, very slowly, the music started to come out right. By the time 6 months had passed, Theo could play entire pieces from memory, songs he didn't even know the names of. Songs that had been written by composers who lived hundreds of years ago. He didn't know any of that. He just knew the way the music made him feel. He never told his father. He was afraid it would make him sad. He knew his dad wanted to give him real lessons. A real piano. A real chance. Theo didn't want him to feel like he had failed, so the secret stayed hidden. Until one Thursday afternoon in October, Raymond got a call from his supervisor that day. 2 other janitors had called in sick. They needed him to come in early and bring someone to help with the extra work. Raymond didn't have anyone to call. He couldn't leave Theo alone for that long. So he made a decision he had never made before. He brought his son to work with him. "Just stay close to me," Raymond said as they walked through the back entrance of the academy. "Don't touch anything. Don't wander off. Okay?" Theo nodded. His eyes were wide. He had heard so many stories about this place. The tall ceilings, the polished floors, the music that floated through the halls. But seeing it in person was something else entirely. For the first hour, everything went fine. Theo sat quietly in the storage room while his father worked. He flipped through an old magazine. He counted the tiles on the ceiling. He tried to stay out of the way, but then Raymond got called to the other side of the building. A pipe had burst in one of the bathrooms. He told Theo to wait right there. He said he would be back in 10 minutes. Theo waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then 15. He got up and walked to the door. The hallway outside was long and empty. The lights were dim. He could hear the faint echo of his own footsteps as he stepped out. He didn't mean to wander. He just wanted to look around. One hallway led to another. Then another. And then, without realizing it, he found himself standing in front of a large wooden door. It was open just a crack. Theo pushed it gently. The door swung open without a sound. And there it was, the grand piano. It sat on the stage just like his father had described. Long and black and shiny. The golden lights made it glow like something out of a dream. Theo felt his heart begin to race. His hands started to tremble. He walked toward it slowly. His footsteps echoed in the empty hall. He climbed the 3 small steps to the stage. And then he stood in front of the piano, looking down at the keys. They were perfect, clean and white and waiting. He reached out his hand. His fingers hovered over the keys. He told himself not to touch it. He told himself to walk away, but the music inside him was too strong. He sat down on the bench, and he didn't know it yet, but his whole life was about to change. Theo sat on the bench and felt the cool wood beneath his fingers. The piano was even more beautiful up close. He could see his own reflection in the polished black surface. He looked small. He looked like he didn't belong here. But something deep inside him said otherwise. He placed his hands on the keys. They felt different from the broken keyboard at home. These keys were smooth. They had weight. When he pressed down just slightly, the sound that came out was so pure, so rich, that it almost made him want to cry. He pressed another key, then another. The notes floated through the empty hall like whispers. Theo closed his eyes. For a moment, he forgot where he was. He forgot that he wasn't supposed to be here. He forgot everything except the music, but he wasn't alone. At the back of the recital hall, a door opened quietly. A man stepped inside. He was tall and thin, with gray hair slicked back and sharp eyes behind round glasses. He wore a dark suit with a silk tie. His shoes clicked against the marble floor as he walked closer. His name was Professor Whitmore. He had been teaching at Belmont Music Academy for over 30 years. He was famous in the world of classical music. He had trained some of the most talented pianists in the country. And he had a reputation for being proud, cold, and difficult to impress. Professor Whitmore had come back to the academy that evening to collect some papers from his office. He wasn't expecting to hear anything. But when the sound of the piano reached his ears, he stopped in his tracks. His first thought was that one of his students had stayed late to practice. But when he looked at the stage, he didn't see a student. He saw a boy, a small boy in worn-out clothes, sitting at his piano. His piano. The professor's face turned hard. He stood there in the shadows for a moment, watching. The boy didn't notice him. The boy was too lost in the music, and that made the professor even more annoyed. He walked down the center aisle with loud, deliberate steps. His shoes echoed through the hall. Theo's eyes snapped open. He pulled his hands back from the keys like they were on fire. He spun around on the bench and saw the tall man approaching. What do you think you're doing? Professor Whitmore's voice was sharp. It cut through the silence like a blade. Theo couldn't speak. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He felt his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The professor climbed the steps to the stage. He looked down at the boy with cold eyes. Do you have any idea whose piano this is? Do you have any idea what this instrument is worth? Theo shook his head quickly. I'm sorry, he whispered. I didn't mean to. You didn't mean to what? Break in? Touch things that don't belong to you? The professor's voice grew louder. Where are your parents? Who let you in here? Just then, the door at the back of the hall burst open. Raymond rushed in, still holding his mop. His face was covered in sweat. He had searched every room in the building before someone told him they saw a boy walking toward the recital hall. His heart nearly stopped when he saw his son on that stage, standing in front of the most important man at the academy. Theo, he called out, running down the aisle. Theo, come here, right now. Professor Whitmore turned and looked at Raymond. His eyes moved up and down, taking in the janitor's uniform, the worn shoes, the tired face. A small, cruel smile appeared on his lips. He said slowly. So this is your boy. Raymond reached the stage and pulled Theo behind him. I'm so sorry, sir. I had to bring him with me tonight. I told him to stay in the back. I didn't know he would. You didn't know he would wander into my recital hall and put his dirty hands on a $60,000 piano? The professor raised an eyebrow. Is that what you're telling me? Raymond's face burned with shame. He bowed his head. It won't happen again, sir. I promise. By now, a few other people had gathered near the doorway. 2 other janitors. A security guard. A young woman who worked in the front office. They all watched quietly, not sure what to do. Professor Whitmore looked at the small crowd. Then he looked back at Theo, who was still hiding behind his father. The cruel smile returned to his face. Tell me something, boy, he said, his voice turning soft and mocking. Were you trying to play the piano just now? Is that what you were doing? Theo didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the floor. Look at me when I'm speaking to you, the professor snapped. Theo slowly lifted his head. His eyes were filled with fear. But there was something else there too. Something the professor didn't notice. A quiet spark of defiance. I asked you a question, the professor continued. Were you trying to play? Theo nodded once. The professor laughed. It was a cold, hollow sound. You? A janitor's son? Playing classical piano? He shook his head like it was the funniest thing he had ever heard. Do you even know what music is? Have you ever had a lesson in your life? Theo shook his head. Of course not. The professor turned to the small crowd near the door. Did you hear that? This child has never had a single lesson, and yet here he is, sitting at a concert grand like he belongs here. One of the janitors shifted uncomfortably. The woman from the front office looked away. Raymond stepped forward. Please, sir. He's just a boy. He made a mistake. Let me take him home. I'll make sure it never happens again. But the professor wasn't finished. He was enjoying this too much. He had spent his whole life surrounded by privilege and perfection. He looked down on anyone who didn't meet his standards. And right now, this janitor and his son were easy targets. Wait, the professor said, holding up his hand. I want to give the boy a chance. Raymond froze. What do you mean? Professor Whitmore smiled. It was not a kind smile. Let him play. The room went silent. You heard me, the professor said, turning back to Theo. You were so eager to touch my piano. So go ahead. Show us what you can do. Play something. Theo's face went pale. He looked up at his father. Raymond's jaw was tight. His fists were clenched. He wanted to scoop up his son and walk out of that room, but he knew that if he did, he would probably lose his job. And without this job, they had nothing. The professor leaned in closer to Theo. What's the matter? Afraid? Theo didn't answer. I'll tell you what, the professor said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. If this boy can sit down and play anything worth hearing, anything at all, I will get down on my knees right here in front of all of you. A gasp came from somewhere near the door. The professor straightened up, looking proud of himself. But if he can't, and I'm sure he can't, then you will both leave this building tonight and never come back. Raymond felt his stomach drop. He opened his mouth to protest. But before he could say anything, Theo stepped forward. The boy looked up at the tall, proud man who had mocked him. He looked at the crowd near the door. He looked at his father, whose eyes were full of worry. And then, without a word, Theo walked toward the piano. The room felt frozen. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. All eyes were on the small boy walking toward the grand piano. Theo's legs felt heavy. Each step seemed to take forever. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. His hands were trembling. His throat was dry, but he kept walking. Behind him, Raymond stood paralyzed. Every part of him wanted to grab his son and run out of that room. He wanted to protect him from what was about to happen. He was sure this would end in humiliation. His boy had never had a lesson. He had never even touched a real piano before tonight. How could he possibly play anything? But there was something in the way Theo moved that made Raymond stay quiet. There was something in his son's eyes that he had never seen before. A calm, a focus, like the boy knew something that no one else in that room understood. Professor Whitmore stood with his arms crossed, a smug look on his face. He was already thinking about what he would say after the boy failed. He was already imagining the look of defeat on the janitor's face. This was going to be entertaining. Near the doorway, the small crowd watched nervously. The security guard scratched the back of his neck. The woman from the front office bit her lip. One of the janitors whispered to the other, "This isn't right. He's just a kid." But nobody stepped forward. Nobody said a word. Theo reached the piano. He stood in front of the bench and looked down at the keys. They were glowing under the soft golden lights. For a moment, he just stared at them. $60,000. The professor had said. This piano was worth more than everything his father had ever earned. But to Theo, it wasn't about the money, it was about the music. He sat down slowly. The bench felt solid beneath him. He placed his feet flat on the floor. He took a deep breath. Then he lifted his hands and let them hover over the keys. Someone near the back of the room let out a quiet snicker. Theo heard it. He felt his cheeks burn. Doubt crept into his mind. What if he couldn't do this? What if his hands froze up? What if the broken keyboard at home had taught him nothing? He glanced over at his father. Raymond's face was tight with worry. But when their eyes met, something passed between them. Raymond gave the smallest nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Theo turned back to the piano. He thought about all those nights lying in bed, listening to his father hum. He thought about the melodies that filled their tiny apartment. He thought about his mother, even though he barely remembered her face. He thought about the promise his father had made to give him a good life. And then he pressed a single key. The note rang out through the hall. It was clear. It was perfect. It hung in the air, like a drop of water, falling into a still pond. Everyone went silent. Professor Whitmore's smile flickered. Theo pressed another key, then another. The notes came slowly at first, one by one, like careful footsteps on a narrow bridge. But then they started to flow. They connected. They became something more. It was Clair de Lune, one of the most beautiful piano pieces ever written. A piece that took most students years to master. A piece filled with emotion, with longing, with quiet sadness and gentle hope. And this 12-year-old boy, who had never had a single lesson, was playing it from memory. The woman near the door gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. The security guard's jaw dropped open. One of the janitors took a step closer, his eyes wide with disbelief. Professor Whitmore uncrossed his arms. The smug expression on his face began to fade. His eyes narrowed as he watched the boy's fingers move across the keys. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. But it was happening right in front of him. Theo didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the professor. He kept his eyes closed and let the music carry him. Every note was like a word in a language he had always known, but never spoken out loud. His fingers moved on their own, guided by something deeper than thought. He remembered the nights when his father came home tired and sat on the edge of his bed. He remembered the soft humming that filled the darkness. He remembered pressing the broken keys on his hidden keyboard, trying again and again until the sounds matched what he heard in his head. All those hours. All that practice. All those secret moments when he poured his heart into something no one else knew about. It was all coming out now. The music swelled. The melody rose and fell like waves on a quiet shore. There were moments of deep sadness, and moments of light breaking through the clouds. It was the kind of music that reached into your chest and squeezed your heart. Raymond stood frozen in place. Tears were forming in his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. He didn't even blink. He just watched his son, his quiet, humble son, create something so beautiful that it took his breath away. He had no idea. All this time, he had no idea what Theo had been doing. All those nights when he thought the boy was sleeping, Theo had been teaching himself to play, using nothing but a broken keyboard and the melodies his father hummed to him. Raymond's chest tightened. He thought about all the times he had felt like a failure, all the times he wished he could give his son more. Better clothes, better food, a real education, a future. But standing here now, watching Theo play, he realized something. He had already given him something. Something that couldn't be bought. Something that no amount of money could replace. He had given him music. The piece moved into its final section. The notes grew softer, slower, more delicate. Theo's fingers barely touched the keys now. Each sound was like a whisper, a secret being shared between the piano and the boy. And then, with one final note, the music stopped. Theo lifted his hands from the keys. He opened his eyes. He didn't move. The hall was completely silent. No one clapped. No one spoke. It was as if everyone had forgotten how to breathe. Professor Whitmore stood still as a statue. His face had gone pale. His lips were pressed together in a thin line. He stared at the boy on the stage like he was looking at something impossible. The woman near the door had tears streaming down her face. She didn't even try to hide them. The security guard shook his head slowly, over and over, like he was trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed. One of the janitors, an older man who had worked at the academy for 15 years, spoke in a low voice. "I've heard a lot of students play in this room, but I've never heard anything like that." Still, no one moved. Theo sat on the bench, his hands resting in his lap. He looked small and tired. He didn't know if what he had done was good enough. He didn't know if it was what the professor wanted. He only knew that he had given everything he had. He turned his head and looked at his father. Raymond's face was wet with tears, but he was smiling. It was the proudest smile Theo had ever seen. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the professor, not the job, not the fancy building or the expensive piano or the people watching, just a father and a son, connected by something words could never explain. But the silence in the room didn't last forever, because now, everyone was waiting to see what Professor Whitmore would do next. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Nobody dared to speak. Nobody dared to move. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights above the stage. Professor Whitmore stood frozen in place. His arms hung loosely at his sides. His face, which had been so full of arrogance just minutes ago, was now unreadable. He stared at Theo like he was seeing him for the first time. Theo stayed seated on the bench. His hands were still in his lap. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know if he should stand up, apologize, or run. So he just sat there, waiting. The woman from the front office wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The security guard shifted his weight from one foot to the other. One of the janitors cleared his throat quietly, but said nothing. Everyone was watching the professor. Professor Whitmore had spent his entire life in the world of music. He had studied at the finest schools. He had performed in concert halls across Europe. He had trained students who went on to win international competitions. He knew talent when he saw it. He knew brilliance when he heard it. And what he had just heard was something rare, something that didn't come from practice alone, something that couldn't be taught. He had made a promise in front of everyone, a bold, arrogant promise meant to humiliate a child. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that this boy, this janitor's son, would fail. But the boy hadn't failed. The boy had done the impossible. Professor Whitmore took a slow breath. His chest rose and fell. He looked down at the floor for a long moment. Then, he lifted his head and looked directly at Theo. The boy's eyes met his. There was no anger in them, no pride, no revenge, just the quiet, honest gaze of a child who had done his best. Something shifted inside the professor. A wall that had been standing for decades began to crack. He thought about his own childhood. He thought about the first time he had touched a piano. He remembered the way his heart had raced, the way the music had called to him like a voice from another world. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that feeling. He had replaced wonder with ego. He had replaced love with control. But this boy, this small, untrained boy, had brought it all back. Without a word, Professor Whitmore stepped forward. His shoes clicked against the stage as he walked toward the piano. The crowd near the door held their breath. He stopped in front of Theo. For a moment, nobody knew what he was going to do. Raymond's heart pounded. He clenched his fists, ready to step in if the professor said anything cruel. But the professor didn't speak. Instead, he did something no one expected. Slowly, carefully, Professor Whitmore lowered himself down. First one knee touched the floor, then the other. He knelt there, in front of the boy, in front of everyone. A soft gasp echoed through the room. The professor's head was bowed, his hands rested on his thighs. He stayed like that for several seconds, not moving, not speaking. Then he looked up at Theo. "I made a promise," he said quietly. His voice was different now. The sharpness was gone. There was something raw in it, something honest. "And I intend to keep it." Theo didn't know what to say. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The professor continued. "I have been teaching at this academy for 31 years. I have heard hundreds of students play in this very hall. Some of them were good, a few of them were great." He paused and shook his head slowly. "But I have never heard anyone play the way you just did." The room was completely still. Raymond felt his knees go weak. He reached out and grabbed the edge of a nearby chair to steady himself. Tears were still falling down his face. But he didn't care anymore. He didn't care who saw. Professor Whitmore looked at Raymond. "Your son has a gift," he said. "A gift that cannot be taught. It can only be born. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Raymond nodded, even though he wasn't sure he fully understood. All he knew was that his boy, his quiet, gentle boy, had done something extraordinary. The professor turned back to Theo. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked. "Who taught you?" Theo hesitated. He glanced at his father. Then he spoke in a small voice. "Nobody taught me." The professor frowned. "That's not possible. You played Clair de Lune. That piece requires years of training." Theo shook his head. "I never had lessons. I listened." "Listened to what?" Theo looked at his father again. This time, his eyes were shining with tears of his own. "My dad," he said. "He hums to me every night. Songs he hears here at the academy. I remembered them, and I practiced on an old keyboard I found. Most of the keys were broken, but I kept trying until it sounded right." The professor stared at him. His mouth opened, then closed again. He looked like a man who had just been told the world was upside down. "You taught yourself," he said slowly. "From memory, on a broken keyboard." Theo nodded. Professor Whitmore let out a long breath. He brought one hand up and pressed it against his forehead. For a moment, he just stayed there, kneeling on the stage, trying to process what he had just heard. Then he laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh this time. It was soft, amazed, full of wonder. "Unbelievable," he whispered. "Absolutely unbelievable." He rose to his feet slowly. His knees cracked as he stood. He brushed off his pants and straightened his jacket. But he didn't look proud anymore. He looked humbled. He turned to the small crowd near the door. "Did you all see that?" he asked. "Did you hear it?" The woman from the front office nodded. Her face was still wet with tears. "This boy," the professor said, pointing at Theo, "has more natural talent than anyone I have ever met. And I almost threw him out like garbage." He shook his head in disgust, but the disgust was aimed at himself. "I owe you an apology," he said to Raymond. "Both of you. I judged you by your clothes, by your job, by things that don't matter." He paused. "And I was wrong." Raymond didn't know how to respond. No one had ever apologized to him like this. Especially not someone like Professor Whitmore. "I don't need an apology, sir," Raymond said quietly. "I just want my son to be okay." The professor nodded. "He's more than okay," he said. "He's extraordinary." He turned back to Theo. The boy was still sitting on the bench, looking overwhelmed by everything that had happened. "Young man," the professor said, "I don't know what kind of future you've imagined for yourself, but I want you to know something. What you did tonight, what you showed me tonight, it changed something in me." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small card. He handed it to Theo. "That's my personal number," he said. "I want you to call me. There are people I need to introduce you to. Opportunities I want to open for you." Theo looked at the card. His hands were trembling. "I know I don't deserve your trust," the professor added. "Not after how I treated you. But I hope you'll give me a chance to make it right." Theo looked up at him. Then he looked at his father. Raymond gave a slow nod. His heart was full in a way he couldn't describe. Theo turned back to the professor. "Okay," he said softly. And for the first time that night, Professor Whitmore smiled a real smile. It was the kind of smile that meant something had truly changed. That night, Raymond and Theo walked home in silence. The streets were dark and quiet. A cold wind blew through the empty sidewalks. But neither of them felt the cold. They were still trying to understand what had just happened. When they reached their small apartment, Raymond unlocked the door and stepped inside. He turned on the light. Everything looked the same. The tiny kitchen, the worn-out couch, the crack in the ceiling that he kept meaning to fix. But somehow, everything felt different. Theo walked past him and sat down on the edge of his bed. He was still holding the professor's card in his hand. He hadn't let go of it since they left the academy. Raymond stood in the doorway, watching his son. His heart was still full. His eyes were still red from crying. He didn't have the words for what he was feeling. Finally, he walked over and sat down next to Theo. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked softly. Theo looked up at him. "Tell you what?" "About the keyboard, about the practicing, about all of it." Theo looked down at the floor. "I didn't want you to feel bad," he said quietly. "I know you wanted to give me real lessons. A real piano. I didn't want you to think you weren't enough." Raymond felt something break inside his chest. He reached out and pulled his son into a tight hug. He held him there for a long time, not saying anything. "You listen to me," Raymond said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me. Everything I do for you. And tonight, you made me the proudest father in the whole world." Theo buried his face in his father's shoulder. His small body trembled as he started to cry. Not sad tears. Not scared tears. Just the kind of tears that come when everything you've been holding inside finally finds a way out. They stayed like that for a long time. The next morning, Raymond woke up early. He made breakfast, eggs and toast. The same as every other day. But when he sat down at the table, he noticed the professor's card sitting next to Theo's plate. "Are you going to call him?" Raymond asked. Theo nodded slowly. "I think so. But only if you say it's okay." Raymond smiled. "It's more than okay." Later that day, Theo made the call. His hands were shaking as he dialed the number. The phone rang twice before the professor answered. "Hello? Hi, this is Theo. From last night." There was a pause. Then the professor's voice came through, warm and kind. "I was hoping you'd call. How are you feeling today? Okay, I guess. A little tired. The professor chuckled softly. That's understandable. You did something remarkable last night. It takes a lot out of a person. Lone, over 7. They talked for almost 20 minutes. The professor asked about Theo's life, his school, his interests. He listened carefully to everything the boy said, and by the end of the conversation, he had already made a plan. I want to offer you a full scholarship to the academy, the professor said. Tuition, books, everything. You won't have to pay a single cent. Theo's heart nearly stopped. Are you serious? Completely. But that's not all. I've already spoken to a few colleagues of mine. There's a conservatory in the city, one of the best in the country. They want to meet you. They've heard about what happened, and they're very interested. Theo couldn't believe what he was hearing. Just yesterday, he was hiding a broken keyboard under his bed. Now, people were talking about conservatories and scholarships. I don't know what to say, Theo whispered. You don't have to say anything, the professor replied. Just keep playing. That's all I ask. Over the next few months, Theo's life changed in ways he never imagined. He started lessons at the academy. He had access to real pianos, real teachers, real sheet music. He practiced for hours every day, soaking up everything like a sponge. Professor Whitmore became his mentor. The man who had once mocked him now spent hours teaching him, guiding him, pushing him to be better. He was tough at times. He expected a lot, but there was a kindness in him now that hadn't been there before. You changed me, you know, the professor told Theo one afternoon. I had forgotten why I fell in love with music in the first place. You reminded me. Theo didn't fully understand what that meant at the time, but years later, he would. Raymond kept working at the academy, but things were different now. The other staff treated him with more respect. The teachers nodded at him in the hallways. Some of them even stopped to talk. He never asked for any of it. He was just happy to watch his son grow. 5 years passed. Theo was 17 now. He had won 3 national competitions. His name had appeared in magazines and newspapers. People called him a prodigy, a genius, a once-in-a-generation talent. But Theo never let it go to his head. He stayed humble. He stayed kind. He never forgot where he came from. And then came the night that changed everything once more. It was a cold evening in December. Snow was falling softly outside the windows of Carnegie Hall. Inside, the seats were filled with people in fine clothes. Critics, musicians, celebrities. Everyone had come to hear the young pianist who had taken the world by storm. Backstage, Theo stood alone in a quiet corner. He was wearing a black suit and a crisp white shirt. His hands were steady, but his heart was racing. There was a knock on the door. He turned around. It was Raymond. His father looked older now. His hair had more gray in it. His face had more lines. But his eyes were the same, full of love, full of pride. You ready? Raymond asked. Theo smiled. I think so. Raymond walked over and placed his hands on his son's shoulders. I want you to know something. No matter what happens out there tonight, I'm already proud of you. I've been proud of you since the day you were born. Theo felt tears sting his eyes. I wouldn't be here without you, Dad. You know that, right? Raymond shook his head. No. You did this. All of it. I just hummed a few songs. Theo laughed softly. Those songs meant everything to me. Raymond pulled him into a hug. Go out there and show them who you are. A few minutes later, Theo walked onto the stage. The lights were bright. The audience was silent. The grand piano sat waiting for him, just like it had that night at the academy all those years ago. He sat down on the bench. He placed his hands over the keys, and then he played. The music filled the hall. It rose to the ceiling. It reached into every corner, every heart, every soul. It was the same piece he had played that night in the academy, Clair de Lune. But now, it was deeper, richer, more alive. In the front row, Professor Whitmore sat with tears in his eyes. He had watched this boy grow from a frightened child into a master, and he had never been more grateful to be proven wrong. A few seats away, Raymond sat with his hands folded in his lap. He didn't understand everything about music. He couldn't read a single note. But he understood this. He understood that love was the most powerful teacher in the world. When the final note faded into silence, the audience rose to their feet. The applause thundered through the hall like a wave. People cheered. People cried. But Theo didn't hear any of it. He was looking at his father, and Raymond was looking back at him. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the fame, not the success, not the standing ovation. Just a father and a son, connected by something that would never fade. The music had brought them here, but it was love that made them stay. 10 years had passed since that night at Carnegie Hall. Theo was 27 now. His name was known around the world. He had performed in Paris, London, Tokyo, and Vienna. He had released albums that sold millions of copies. He had won awards that most musicians only dreamed of, but through it all, he never changed. He still called his father every single day. He still visited the old apartment whenever he could, and he still remembered the boy he used to be, the one who practiced on a broken keyboard hidden under his bed. One autumn afternoon, Theo returned to the city where it all began. He had been invited to give a special performance at Belmont Music Academy. It was the same academy where his father had worked as a janitor. The same academy where Professor Whitmore had once tried to humiliate him. The same academy that had changed his life forever. Professor Whitmore had passed away 2 years earlier. He had lived long enough to see Theo become everything he knew he could be. On his final day, he had held Theo's hand and whispered, "Thank you for reminding me what music is supposed to feel like." Theo had cried for hours after he was gone. Now, the academy had built a new concert hall in the professor's name, and Theo had been asked to be the first person to perform there. He arrived early that evening. The building looked different than he remembered. The walls had been repainted. The floors had been polished. New portraits hung in the hallways, but some things hadn't changed. The smell of old wood and rosin still lingered in the air. The echoes of students practicing still floated through the corridors. Theo walked through the halls slowly, taking it all in. Memories came flooding back with every step. He remembered the night he had wandered into that recital hall. He remembered the fear in his chest. He remembered the way his hands had trembled over the keys. He smiled to himself. That scared little boy felt like someone from another lifetime. As he turned a corner, he heard something. A sound coming from one of the practice rooms. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone was playing the piano. Theo stopped and listened. The melody was clumsy at first, hesitant, full of mistakes. But there was something underneath it. A feeling. A soul. The kind of raw emotion that couldn't be taught. He walked toward the sound. The door to the practice room was open just a crack. He pushed it gently and looked inside. A young girl sat at an old upright piano. She looked about 10 or 11 years old. Her clothes were worn and faded. Her shoes had holes in them. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She didn't notice Theo standing in the doorway. She was too focused on the keys. Theo watched her for a moment. She was trying to play a simple melody, but her fingers kept slipping. She would make a mistake, shake her head in frustration, and then start again from the beginning, over and over. He recognized that determination. He had seen it in himself once. He knocked softly on the door. The girl jumped and spun around. Her eyes went wide when she saw him. She clearly recognized his face. Everyone in the music world knew who he was. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, standing up from the bench. "I'm not supposed to be in here. My mom works in the kitchen downstairs. She told me to wait. But I just wanted to." "It's okay," Theo said gently. He stepped into the room and smiled. "I used to do the same thing." The girl blinked. "You did?" "My father worked here too. He was a janitor. I used to sneak into the recital hall when no one was around." He nodded toward the piano. "Do you take lessons?" The girl shook her head. "We can't afford them." I just try to learn on my own. I watch videos on my mom's phone sometimes. Theo felt a lump form in his throat. It was like looking into a mirror that showed him exactly who he used to be. He walked over and sat down on the bench next to her. What were you trying to play? The girl looked embarrassed. It's stupid. Play it for me, Theo said softly. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she turned back to the piano. Her small fingers found the keys. She started to play. It was rough, unpolished, full of wrong notes. But Theo didn't hear the mistakes. He heard the heart behind them. He heard the longing, the hunger, the same fire that had once burned inside him. When she finished, she looked up at him nervously. It's not very good. Theo shook his head. No, it's not good. He paused and smiled. It's beautiful. The girl's eyes widened. Really? Really? You have something special. I can hear it. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook. He wrote something on a piece of paper and handed it to her. This is the number for the Academy's scholarship office, he said. I'm going to make a call tonight. I want you to apply. Tell them Theo sent you. The girl stared at the paper like it was made of gold. But I don't know how to read music. I've never had a real lesson. Theo placed a hand on her shoulder. Neither did I. And look where I am now. He stood up and walked toward the door. Then he stopped and turned back. One more thing, he said. Never let anyone tell you that you don't belong. Not because of where you come from. Not because of what you don't have. The only thing that matters is what's inside you. The girl nodded slowly. Tears were forming in her eyes. Theo smiled. I'll see you around. That night, Theo performed in the new concert hall. The seats were filled with important people. Critics. Musicians. Donors. But he didn't play for them. He played for the girl in the practice room. He played for his father, who was sitting in the front row, older now but still proud as ever. He played for Professor Whitmore, whose spirit seemed to fill the room. And he played for the boy he used to be. The one who had nothing but a broken keyboard and a father who hummed him to sleep every night. After the performance, Raymond met him backstage. His father's eyes were wet, just like they had been all those years ago. You did good tonight, Raymond said. Theo hugged him tight. I learned from the best. Raymond laughed softly. I never taught you anything. Theo pulled back and looked at him. You taught me everything, Dad. You just didn't know it. They walked out of the building together, side by side. The night was cool and quiet. Stars dotted the sky above them. As they reached the car, Theo paused and looked back at the academy one last time. Somewhere inside that building, a young girl was holding a piece of paper with a phone number on it. She was probably scared. She was probably doubting herself. She probably didn't believe that her life could change. But Theo knew better. Because once upon a time, he had been that kid too. And someone had believed in him when no one else did. Now it was his turn to do the same. The music would continue. The legacy would live on. Not through fame, not through awards, but through the simple act of believing in someone who had nothing but a dream. And that, Theo knew, was the most powerful song of all.